Trevs Show. I'm the Trev. It's too sweet. Anyway, continuing on with retired numbers. And I'm not going to lie, there's a lot to unpack here. I've also been working on this one for a better part of a year. Not for lack of effort, just because there's a lot to unpack and I kind of want to get it right. I don't want it to look bad, especially given who we're talking about on this one. But anyway, I can also promise you that this video will spawn off a lot of other videos, which will come in time. But we're counting chickens here. Let's talk about the second number, retired by the Montreal Canadiens, that belonging to the Rocket, number 9, Maurice Richard. Let's do it. So Maurice Richard's 18-year career, all with the Montreal Canadiens, starts off in 1942-43 season, where Richard earned a tryout and eventually made the team, debuting with the number 15. Now, he managed a respectable rookie campaign, given that he only played 16 games, but in those 16 games, he managed 11 points. And it would have been better if it was a little more than 16 games, but ultimately, injuries caught up to his debut season, which caused him to miss not just a significant amount of time, but also the playoffs as well. Heading into the 1943-44 campaign, he managed to do what makes this video, in terms of topic, important. He switched his number 15 in for the more familiar number 9. And this is done more for humbling reasons as opposed to anything else, as he wanted his number to match his daughter's birth weight. That was very thoughtful. It's also during this season that he would be placed on the punch line with line mates Elmer Locke, who we will talk about, and Toe Blake. Now, Richard replaced Joe Benoit in this line, as Benoit had joined the armed forces and left the team. It was also during this season where his teammate, Ray Getliff, would dub him with the now legendary nickname of the Rocket, as he described by not just what his team, but also many print reporters would see. They would come down the ice with the puck on most occasions like a rocket. And it stuck. Now, the Canadiens would finish the season first overall in the league, with Richard finishing third on team scoring with 54 points, and being first in the league guarantees you basically a shot to the playoffs. And the Canadiens would play typical Canadiens hockey and ride their wave all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals to win their 5th Stanley Cup in team history. This would be Richard's first. Now, Richard would finish second in team points in the playoffs with 17 points in 9 games, but those 12 goals were the league lead. And amongst those 12 goals also came a 5-goal effort against the Toronto Maple Leafs, which in itself tied a league record with New Zealand alone for most goals scored in one playoff game, as well as earned him first, second, and third star nominations for that game. And for the first time in his career, Richard would also be named to the NHL's second All-Star team at the end of the season. Ultimately, though, it's the 1944-45 season that is by and far one of the most memorable seasons. And that could be attributed a lot to not just the records he was making, but the records he was breaking. At first, he would set a new mark of points in a game when he scored 5 goals and added 3 assists for 8 points against the Detroit Red Wings on December 28th, 1944. That record would stand for 32 years before ultimately being broken. Now, that 8-point night came on a night when he was suffering from exhaustion, as he had moved into his brand new home in Montreal that day. But his rate of scoring during this season had him also break a 27-year-old record set by Joe Malone, as on February 20th, 1945, he would set a new mark for goals in a season, scoring his 45th goal, with Joe Malone in attendance, who would eventually come and award Richard the same puck he scored that goal with. Of course, the next logical step after you break a record is to expand on it, which is exactly what Richard did. Now, I can probably say with a shadow of truth that trying to set that new mark wasn't easy given the rate that he was scoring goals and the way opposing teams did everything they could to stop him from scoring more goals. But in the Canadiens' final game of the season, or game number 50, on the road against the Boston Bruins, Richard would score goal number 50, with 2:15 remaining in what would be a 4-2 Montreal win. So not only did he set a new record for goals in a season with 50, which made him the first player in league history to score 50, that would also be his career best in goals, which, as for the record, stood for 16 years before someone would tie it and 21 years before someone would break it. So not only was he the first player to score 50 in a season, he was also the first player to score 50 goals in 50 games or less, something that he would stand alone as for 36 years. Now, on top of scoring goals, he did manage to finish with the season with 73 points, which was good for second in the league and team scoring, with the punchline, Blake, Locke, and Richard finishing 1, 2, and 3 in league scoring. Now, given the season he had, got him his first Hart Memorial Trophy nomination. Now, that's just a nomination. He didn't win it. On top of that, he would also be named the NHL's first All-Star team for the first time in his career. And of course, the Canadiens did make it to the playoffs, but it didn't last very long, with Richard scoring 8 points in 6 playoff games. So, not a bad record-making season. So for the 1945-46 season, expectations were understandably high in Montreal, given the season the team had and that Richard had the previous season. Of course, when our expectations not high in Montreal. And while the team didn't disappoint, going first overall in the league, his point production and goal production was nearly half of what was recorded the previous season, scoring only 27 goals and managing only 49 points, which was still good for second in team scoring, and also got himself another first NHL All-Star team nomination. And of course, the Canadiens did make the playoffs and rode that all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals, where they would beat the Boston Bruins for the team's 6th Stanley Cup, or Richard's 2nd Stanley Cup, and would see him finish with playoff scoring 3rd in the team with 11 points in 9 games. So, production's still there, even if it's waning. For the 1946-47 season, Richard managed to get back to his usual standards, with the Canadiens again topping the league in points, and Richard leading the team in points with 45 goals, 26 assists, and 71 points, which was 1 point behind the league leader, who was Max Bentley. And his performance was good enough for his 3rd straight first All-Star team nomination, as well as winning his first and only Hart Memorial Trophy, which is handed out annually to league MVP. So naturally, the Canadiens made the playoffs, and naturally, they rode it all the way to the Stanley Cup Final. But there was an incident in Game 2 of the Cup Finals, which involved Toronto's Bill Iznicki and Richard's stick over Iznicki's head, which ended up getting him suspended for Game 3. And Toronto would end up winning the Stanley Cup 3 games later. But, all told, Richard still led the team in points, scoring 11 points in 10 games. It's also worth pointing out that this was the first season for new NHL president Clarence Campbell, who I can guarantee you we will talk about at some point. So this might be vital to the story. The 1947-48 season would see Richard play in the league's first annual NHL All-Star game, representing the NHL All-Stars against the Stanley Cup champs Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, this would be his first All-Star game of 13 straight. So that's worth noting. And it would be just during this season that you would see a breakup in the punchline, as Toe Blake would suffer what would become a career-ending injury. And Richard's season was also cut short due to injury. But he would still manage 53 points in just as many games, collecting his 4th straight first All-Star team nomination. But the Canadiens would fail to make the playoffs. Ouch. The 1948-49 season would see the Canadiens dip to third in league standings, which was kind of uncharacteristic of them at the time, and would see Richard's production dip once again, although he'd still finish second in team scoring with 38 points in 59 games, which was still good enough for another first All-Star team nomination. It's also worth noting that this is his first season with over 100 penalty minutes. Now, the Canadiens did still make the playoffs, but the ride was not long, as in only 7 games, Richard would only manage 3 points. The 1949-50 season would see Richard once again lead the league in goals with 43, while adding 22 assists for 65 points, which was good enough for the team lead and 4th overall amongst league leaders. And for the second straight year, he managed over 100 penalty minutes. But in only 5 playoff games, he managed 2 points. But he did get another first-team All-Star nod, which made that 6 straight, and got nominated for the Hart Trophy for a 3rd time. For the 1950-51 season, he was able to put another notch in his belt, as he managed to score 42 goals in 65 games, amongst them being goal number 271 to set the new franchise record. And he also had 24 assists for 66 points, which again led the team in scoring, and again had him second in league scoring. Still not quite going over the 1 mark. And once again, Richard was named to the NHL All-Star team, only this time it was the second NHL All-Star team for the 2nd time in his career. But hey, an All-Star nod for the past 8 seasons straight, that's still an All-Star nod, no matter how you look at it. And again, Richard would be nominated for the Hart Memorial Trophy, as the Canadiens got back to the playoffs and got back all the way to the Stanley Cup Final, only to lose to Toronto. The 1951-52 season would see Richard limited to only 48 games due to injury, but he did manage to finish 3rd in team scoring with 44 points, all while earning another 2nd NHL All-Star team nomination. And while the Canadiens did make it to the playoffs, there's a few memorable moments that happen, the first being in the semifinals against Boston. In this moment against the Bruins, Richard was checked by Leo Labine, and as he fell, he hit his head on Bill Quackenbush's knee, which briefly knocked him unconscious. Now, he did come to, but clearly he wasn't there. Now, he did return to the game late in the 3rd period with a large cut above his eye, and Coach Dick Irvin sent Richard back into the game with minutes left to play, concussion and all. And sometimes good things happen when you bring a guy back into the game after getting his lights knocked out. That's where Richard would go ahead and score the game-winning goal to give Montreal the 2-1 win and a trip to the Stanley Cup Final. And ultimately, this is where this picture comes from. Ultimately, though, this would not be the Canadiens' year, as they would lose the Stanley Cup for the 2nd straight year in 4 games to the Detroit Red Wings. And Richard would finish the playoffs 2nd in team scoring with 6 points. The 1952-53 season would see Richard go for new history, as he had been scoring goals in buckets by this point. He started the season in close pursuit of the career goals record, which was held by Nell Stewart at the time. And on October 29th, 1952, Richard would score goal numbers 323 and 324 against the Toronto Maple Leafs, which effectively tied the record. Now, despite the ovation, or despite the arena they were playing in, he managed to get a really loud and rousing ovation out of the Leafs fans, which, if you know the Toronto-Montreal rivalry, that almost sounds impossible. But for the next 3 games after that, he didn't score anything. Finally, though, on November 8th, 1952, in a home game against Chicago, Richard scored goal number 325 at 10:01 of the 2nd period. Now, according to reports at the time, the ovation that Richard got from the Montreal Forum, scoring the record goal on home ice, literally shook the rafters. Not figuratively, literally shook the rafters. That's quite a feat. And in the process of setting that record, he also became the first player in league history to score at least 20 goals in his first 10 seasons. Again, new history. Now, the Canadiens would make it to the playoffs and would go all the way to Stanley Cup Finals for a third straight year. And with Richard's 8-point contribution, the Canadiens would beat the Boston Bruins for their 7th Stanley Cup in team history, which would ultimately be Richard's 3rd Stanley Cup in his career. This is not something that's going to be a one-and-done thing, just so you know. The 1953-54 season would see his punchline line mate Elmer Luck finally decide to retire, but would also see the full-time addition of one John Beliveau, who I guarantee you we will be talking about at some point. And despite not having his punchline around him anymore, it didn't really seem to affect him all that much, as he still led the team in points with 67 points, which also got him another Hart Trophy nomination. And while his production in the regular season might not have stalled, his production in the playoffs was starting to. As yes, they made the playoffs, and yes, they made it all the way to the Stanley Cup Final for the 4th straight year. Montreal would end up losing to Detroit in 7 games. This is a nice little rivalry these two had in the 50s. Now, the best thing I can mention before we get into the 54-55 season is this part, or the part we will get to, is going to spawn another hockey history video. So look for that when we get there. But it would be in this season where Richard would expand his career goals record by scoring his 400th goal on December 18th, 1954, against the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, coming into March 13th, 1955, Richard had led the league in goals and had set career highs in assists and points with 36 and 74 respectively. It was then that they played the Boston Bruins, and, well, this game is noted for the chain of events that followed, but long story short, it was eventful. So what happened is Richard had gotten into a brawl with Boston's Hal Lacey, and in the process managed to punch a referee in the face. Now, being this was his second incident with an on-ice official, he was kinda in trouble. And that trouble turned into being suspended for the last 3 games of the regular season, as well as the entirety of the 1955 playoffs. And at the time, that was the longest suspension ever handed out by the NHL in its brief history. And as I said, I will get into this topic known as the Richard Riot in a different video, but for the sake of not taking up too much more time, let's continue on. So ultimately the suspension would put an end to his season, but he would end up being tied for the league lead in goals and would lose the Art Ross Trophy by 1 point. Now, he's finished by 1 point off the league lead before, but this is for the newly established, or fairly recent Art Ross Trophy. And that'd be the closest he'd ever get to that. Now, the 55-56 season is noted not just more for the start of the next and last 5 years for Maurice Richard, but it would also be the arrival of his younger brother, Henry Richard, who I guarantee you we will talk about at some point. What was funny was Maurice's nickname is the Rocket, and Richard's nickname was the Pocket Rocket. So you had a pair of Rockets playing at the same time. And this would be also the same time that Richard would stop leading the team in scoring, but still putting up respectable numbers, adding 71 points, helping the Canadiens get to the playoffs once again. And once again, the Canadiens made it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals. And I guess what could be said as kind of a makeup for the previous season, the Canadiens would beat the Detroit Red Wings for the team's 8th Stanley Cup and Richard's 4th. It's also worth noting that, once again, Richard was nominated for the Hart Memorial Trophy. For the 1956-57 season, which would be his 15th season in the league, he would be named captain of the Montreal Canadiens, replacing Emile Bouchard, who had retired prior to the season, who was also another one we will talk about. Now, Richard would finish the season with 62 points, and the Canadiens would go to the playoffs once again. And, well, I think we know how the next couple years ends out. The Canadiens would win the Stanley Cup, once again, their second straight season Stanley Cup, with Richard being named to the NHL's second All-Star team for the sixth and final time in his career. But let's keep it going. The 1957-58 season would see Richard continue to etch his name in the history books of the NHL, as he became the first player in league history to score 500 career goals, doing so against the Chicago Blackhawks on October 19, 1957. And although Richard would be limited to 28 games due to injury, he did manage to contribute 34 points, with the Canadiens continuing their dominance over the league, in not just the regular season, but as well as in the playoffs. Here you would see the Canadiens continue their winning ways by defeating the Detroit Red Wings in the Stanley Cup Finals for their third straight Stanley Cup in a row, basically laying the foundation for their dynasty. And in 10 playoff games, Richard would add 15 points. But in the finals, Richard's more known for scoring the Game 5 winner in overtime for his sixth playoff overtime goal of his career and the third overtime winning goal in a Stanley Cup Finals series, both of which are NHL records. The 58-59 season would see Richard enter the season as the oldest player in the NHL at the time, as he entered the season at 37 years old. And this season would be no real different from the last season, seeing Richard limited to 42 games, again, thanks to injury. But he did manage to play his 13th straight and final All-Star game, adding 38 points in those 42 games. And while he did manage to play 4 games in the playoffs, he did ultimately go pointless for the only time in his career. But he did manage to get his name on a 7th Stanley Cup, which at this point is the Canadiens' 11th overall and 4th in a row. So, yeah, Dynasty. Which now brings us to the 1959-60 season, which ultimately be Maurice Richard's last season in the NHL. And again, he would miss time due to injury, seeing him play in only 51 games, but managing 35 points. And, given the Canadiens' natural style of play during the 50s, yeah, they're going to the playoffs. And it should be foregone conclusion by this point that if they're going to the playoffs, they're going to the Stanley Cup Finals. And ultimately winning another Stanley Cup, their 5th in a row. Something that has never been done before or since, which makes this Maurice's 8th Stanley Cup, as they swept the Toronto Maple Leafs for their 12th cup in franchise history. Now Richard would add 4 points in 8 playoff games to close out that season. So that brings us to September 15th, 1960. As most players were, getting ready and set to play another NHL season, Maurice Richard decided it's best to go out on top. 8 Stanley Cups to your name, 5 in a row, and announced his retirement from the NHL. Now, according to Richard, the topic of retirement had been on his mind for the last 2 seasons, as the amount of injuries began to mount up, and the game was getting faster than Richard was. That happens with, young legs and skill. But at that point, when you can't produce at that level, it's just time to go, right? And that's the story of Maurice Richard and the number 9. Now let's go over some stats. So in 978 games played, all with the Canadiens, he would score a then league record 544 goals with 422 assists for 966 points. And in 132 playoff games, he'd score 82 goals, 44 assists, and 126 points. Now, on top of what we're going to get into here, his numbers are pretty impressive. 13 straight All-Star Game appearances, 1947, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, and 1959. He was an 8-time first-team NHL All-Star, being nominated in 1945, 1946, 1947, 48, 49, 50, 1955, and 1956, as well as a 6-time second-team NHL All-Star, earning nominations in 1944, 1951, 1952, 1953, 1954, and 1957. He won his first and only Hart Memorial Trophy in 1947. He's an 8-time Stanley Cup champion in 1944, 1946, 1953, 1956, 57, 58, 59, and 1960. The 5-year wait period that was in place at the time for admittance into the Hall of Fame was waived for him, and he was inducted into the 1961 class. He's the first player to score 50 goals in a season, 50 goals in 50 games, and 500 goals in an NHL career. The Montreal Canadiens donated the Rocket Richard Trophy, or the Maurice Rocket Richard Trophy, in his honor to be awarded to the NHL's leading goal scorer annually in 1999. He was named one of the NHL's greatest players during the NHL centennial season, and not even a month after his retirement, on October 6, 1960, he became the second Montreal Canadien to have his number retired. So there's that. There's more contributions to Maurice Richard than just stats alone. If you've never seen or read The Hockey Sweater, I highly recommend this. I watched this many, many times as a kid, and that basically set the tone for why it's important to be a Canadiens fan if you're a Canadiens fan from birth, if you're around the region, and the utter disdain for the Maple Leafs in being a Canadiens fan. But yeah, that played a huge impact in, I'm sure, a lot of lives for younger kids that were playing hockey. But my opinion of the guy, and this should be interesting. Now, I'm not going to lie. Richard is one of those guys I would have loved to have seen play live in his prime back in the day. I mean, he's everything that you look for in a modern power forward. Someone who can score, doesn't have to be finesseful, doesn't have to have a lot of pretty behind it, who can lay the body, who can make the plays, make the hits, and overall just be a complete superstar for his generation. I mean, thanks to him, the goal standard is 50 goals, and that's a really good season. I mean, if you could do the 50-50, which a lot of guys haven't replicated, but we will talk about pretty much every one of them that has, that's the standard as far as what a good goal scorer in the league is. But without Richard, without guys like Richard and his quality to the game, it's hard to imagine where the Canadiens would have been without a guy like him. Would they have had the 5 in a row? Would they be, at the time he retired, 12 cups in? Hard to say, but with the pieces that came in during and after Richard, they were set for a very, very, very long time. Now, out of what I have watched of him play, that nickname Rocket is very well earned. He does go down the wing really, really, really fast. And if you're not careful, you might be on the other end of a good Richard hit. But either way, if he's a modern power forward by today's definition, he's probably the greatest power forward that ever came played in the league. And that's just based off what I saw of him. And like I said, his career was well before my time, but you cannot underestimate everything he brought to the league. So his number being retired by Montreal, well deserved. That's all I got. So that's another one of Trevs Hockey Shows. I want to thank you for tuning in, especially if you're right here. Like, I know this is a longer video, but I did say there was a lot to unpack on this, and if you think Richard is long, wait till you get to the further ones. There's some more big names like Richard that I will be covering. But most of all, I really hope you enjoyed this, because I mean, like I said, this sets my standard now. If I can't do a Richard video and give it justice, what chance do I have for the Lemieux, the Gretzkys, the Mikitas, the Hulls? You name it. But either way, I really do hope you like this video. So if you're still here listening to me talk about my appreciation, give me a like. I think I've earned it. And that red button that says subscribe all over it, if you haven't subscribed by now, what's holding you up? It'll make you feel good. And we're pushing that 250 mark, so let's make it happen. a social that I never use. It's in the description down below. Let's move forward to retired numbers. I've got myself set up to at least the point of 50. And that's maybe just scratching the surface of how much more I have. But either way, in the meantime, in between time, be looking for more videos from Trev. Later.